Welcome to the Dr. J vlog series. It's Friday, January 24th, 2025. Fridays are devoted to the study of human behavior and justifications. Truth be told, I must confess that that's a personal bias of mine. It's why I decided some 4 decades ago to make a living at being a social scientist. And speaking of bias, coincidentally, that's the topic for today's discussion. Are you biased? And the short answer, of course, and don't take offense at this, is yes, you are. And so am I. And I'm going to explain how and why that's the case in just a moment. You see, in my line of work, I have to do a lot of reading, which is ironic because I really wasn't that much of a reader when I was growing up. But then I became attracted to reading, inspired by a few great teachers, and certainly at university. And before you knew it, I became something of a Forrest Gump of reading. Once I really started, I just couldn't stop reading. I just kept reading, crisscrossing the US and Canada with all my reading. And before you knew it, I found that I had something of a cadre of followers reading along with me, almost like a cult. And they even had a name, the cult. They were called university students. Anyway, about all that reading. It's not really a brag, honestly. It's more of a statement about my occupational hazards, or requirements, actually. If I'd been an NBA basketball player, professional basketball player, I'd be shooting hundreds of shots every day and free throws every day. But in my line of work, since I'm a professional social scientist, I read hundreds of pages every day. And that's all. And so do the most dedicated of my colleagues and those cult followers, too, those university students. Anyway, so today I'd like to tackle the issue of human bias. I'm going to base what I say mainly on the work of one of the literally thousands of books that I've read. And in this case, as of 2019, it's also one of the books that I use when I teach a course about hate crimes. The book's titled Biased by Dr. Jennifer L. Eberhardt. You can see her there on screen. And what's the main objective of the book? Well, as a social psychologist, she's rigorously and vigorously scientific. She's had pretty good training, too, having graduated with a PhD from a little known school out east known as Harvard University. She graduated back in 1993 with that PhD. To understand what she's trying to do with her book, consult the subtitle, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Rather ambitious aim, wouldn't you agree? Her main focus, though, is the study of implicit bias, which she describes as, quote, a kind of distorting lens that's a product of both the architecture of our brain and the disparities in our society. As Dr. Eberhardt states up front and through her many examples, we all have ideas about race, even the most open-minded among us. And those ideas have the power to bias our perception, our attention, our memory, and our actions, all despite our conscious awareness and deliberate intentions. End quote. And bias can appear anywhere and everywhere, and invariably does, despite our efforts to be fair-minded and treat others as equal with respect, etc. So, bias unquestionably reflects a ubiquitous aspect of the human condition. And there exists both an evolutionary aspect to our predilection for bias, as well as social and cultural forces that must be examined. But everything starts with our earliest and most consistent experiences, what we have in our environments where we're born. What happens when we're exposed, as infants, to what must initially sound like babble, just a cacophony of sounds created by these creatures that seem to be hovering about us. And of course, occasionally feeding us and swaddling us and doing other sorts of things. They appear to be caring for us, although we don't have the language for it. These would be our parents, usually, the primary caregivers. And we're exposed repeatedly to these sounds. And as our brains develop, of course, these sounds become encoded into our brains. We eventually have the capacity and we start to imitate these sounds and ultimately learn to speak our primary language. We eventually have no choice, if you will, but to daily and repeatedly and consistently learn the language to which we're exposed. Maybe more than one, but most of us just a primary language. And we eventually become the proverbial fish who unthinkingly swim in our linguistic waters. That's where we're comfortable. We form a natural bias, if you will, toward our own language, in the sense that that's what we recognize, where we learn to communicate, to meet our needs, where we can efficiently connect with one another. So here's the key point. We do that with people to whom we're regularly exposed as well. If you're accustomed to speaking a specific language, you'll be biased towards recognizing that language. And similarly, if you go around or hang around people who look like you or look a certain way, that's going to become familiar to you. That's where your comfort level will be, at least initially. And of course, we can learn another language. We can learn to be comfortable in new places and around new people later on, but it's always harder as we get older for a variety of neurological and cultural reasons. Thus, the science of the past half century has confirmed that we're much better at recognizing the faces of our own kind, of our own race, which has been labeled simply as the other race effect. Eberhardt notes in her work that, quote, it's a universal phenomenon that shows up in different racial groups across the United States and in countries all over the world, end quote. It appears early on and only intensifies over time. By the time babies are 3 months old, their brains react more strongly to faces of their own race rather than to the faces of people of other races or who look different. In effect, that's where we get comfortable and we start to build a preference for the faces that we see, and we become better at recognizing them as well. Our brains are literally shaped to some degree by that repeated exposure. On the other hand, it's not surprising either that those who are exposed to multiple languages or multiple faces or other stimuli will grow more accustomed and more comfortable with those differences. And over time, we do indeed develop a bias or preferences for that to which we've been exposed. I love the example of music, use it all the time, because like language, it resonates so deeply in the human brain. It resonates with our experiences, while at the same time having profoundly cultural dimensions. Ever wonder why you like the music that you do and that it may differ from other groups or across generational lines? Well, I've addressed that previously in another video. It's an inescapable fact of our historical and cultural locations that put us in positions to hear different kinds of music, to experience and code those experiences into our long-term memories. And that simply hearing that music with which we're deeply familiar will cause us to sing along or to smile or to react neurologically, emotionally, cognitively, and otherwise. So, in effect, we learn what's important, the faces that we see every day. And over time, our brain, as Dr. Eberhardt points out, builds a preference for those faces. And thus it's quite commonplace for people everywhere to comment that they all look alike, that that's actually a function of biology and exposure. And so we learn what's important in our local environments. Our experiences, the world around us, seep into our brains over time. And without awareness, they conspire to shape and reshape the workings of our minds. Each of us becomes acclimated to the faces we see regularly, as well as the more general shapes and sounds and even smells of our everyday environments. And the emphasis has grown recently in terms of neuroplasticity, which suggests that our brains, in fact, continue to change and develop in response to our environments. And should we be surprised then that those parts of our brain that are stimulated more will show greater development and even enlargement, just like the muscles of our body? Neuroimaging demonstrates that there's actually a neural component of our same race advantage, if you will, in terms of facial recognition. That requires, in my view, essentially less energy and less effort to recognize those who look like ourselves, or more specifically, if they fall into the category of the familiar rather than the unfamiliar. Critically, then, what are we exposed to early on in life? Not just our family, but what about beyond? Well, here's a personal example that I think might help reinforce the point I'm trying to make here. Mildred Inez Deskins Dobson, Mrs. Dobson. Who's Mrs. Dobson? My first and second grade teacher. She's the woman that you see pictured there who taught me properly and formally how to read and helped me develop my writing ability and mathematics and all the usual grade 1 and grade 2 stuff, all the curriculum stuff. And she taught us life lessons as well. And so you can appreciate then that the neighborhood that I grew up in, which was predominantly white, and there were a couple of Asian families and Hispanic families, not too many, one or two black families, but again, overwhelmingly white, at least in the neighborhood where I grew up. So we had much more limited exposure, if you will, to diversity as compared, for example, with the neighborhood where our children grew up in Rexdale, in Etobicoke, Ontario, which is a virtual united nation of different races or peoples from different race and ethno-specific backgrounds. And so in our case, we were literally the minority family as the whites on our particular street. And then I married a Persian woman too, who in our blended family became more diverse. But again, we were still the minority in our particular neighborhood. So, what happens then in terms of familiarity? Well, as a child growing up myself in the 1960s, and in a mostly white suburban neighborhood, we just didn't have that much exposure to diversity. We did happen to have an African American woman who was a housekeeper. I remember coming in who worked about 1 day a week for a period of time. And that gave at least myself and my siblings a little bit of exposure to diversity. But even more so, of course, what happened when I went into school. I had Mrs. Dobson, and you go to school regularly, 5 days a week for most of the year. As a result of those daily experiences, Mrs. Dobson, as my teacher and the authority figure, was the person that I learned the most from, at least for those 2 years. She was my full time teacher. She was the main teacher that I had for the first couple of years of my academic life. At that age and under those conditions, I never remember thinking about race per se. I didn't think, oh, she's an African American woman, black or white or anything else. She was my teacher. That's all. And it was interesting too, because as a teacher, she was excellent. She was strict but fair. She controlled the classroom. And she even pushed us a little bit if she saw something in us. I remember, for example, how she pushed me with my writing and more specifically in terms of mathematics. She found another program for me because for some reason at that age, even then, the numbers somehow came so easily for me. But even more important, I would argue, she provided a safe, secure, respectful classroom and yet a demanding learning environment. And this afforded myself and others the opportunity to develop healthier emotional attachments and cognitive connections to the school environment. I actually quite liked school. School could be cool, a fun place. You got to hang around a bunch of other kids and a bunch of other people your own age. And at least in my case, and with Mrs. Dobson in her classrooms, I was receiving all kinds of positive stimulation on a daily basis, positive feedback and reinforcement. I couldn't have explained any of it that way at the time, but that's what I recall. And that's how I remember my early schooling. I actually, and this is quite true, loved going to school. It provided an organized and positive and even peaceful place compared to some of the disorder and some of what I remember happening in home at the time at home at the time. And there was, of course, the positive, the instrumental stuff that happened there as well. We were engaged in the instrumental tasks of learning the materials from a cognitive standpoint, but also learning to work with others in groups and to start to value that camaraderie, the connectedness, the shared devotion to certain tasks, and that sort of thing. In short, we learned to get along with each other and to start to value what others had to offer, as opposed to putting other people down or making fun of them because they were different or that sort of thing. And I can't tell you how important those lessons were or what that reinforced, especially among us as 6 and 7 and perhaps 8 year olds by the end of grade 2. And finally, school was a place of security where we learned to respect each other and to develop self respect. I remember one day when Mrs. Dobson was reading to us in grade 2, and she typically sat on a small stool, and we'd gather around her sitting on the floor. And one day, a couple of guys in my class, I don't remember, who it was specifically, but I remember they were pointing at her and sort of laughing at themselves under their breath. Mrs. Dobson promptly stopped reading, and she said something like, "I come to school every day, dressed properly, in clean clothes, and that includes my skirt. So I'm not going to be at all embarrassed if you all see the hem of my clean skirt. So, y'all ready to listen? If so, I'll continue with the story." Something along those lines. Now, you see, the boys had been pointing at her skirt and laughing as schoolboys are wont to do when they see something they're not supposed to see. But Mrs. Dobson, of course, quickly put us in her place. And then finally, there's also the aspect of how we nurture the biases that we develop as well. And this is mainly through the process of categorization. This is essential to our brain functioning, and it facilitates our capacity to process information efficiently. We cannot attend to every event and every stimulus, and so we have to filter from our broader environments constantly. And yet, that same filtering process can limit our capacity to truly know other people, at least more intimately or more individually. And so, once we've decided on a category, Dr. Eberhardt notes that our perceptual reality adjusts to suit the label we've settled on. And once we've categorized people as either like us or not like us, well, this can dampen our enthusiasm for getting to know them. And it has another effect too. That is, the social judgments that flow from the categorization process. This often leads to unfavorable evaluations of the proverbial other. We are, as human beings, an extraordinarily evaluative creature. And these evaluations then are not purely a function of our brains. The nature of what we evaluate also, of course, comes from our cultures and what we're taught in terms of the good and the beautiful and the desirable and so on. Culture has an important role too, of course, in terms of the content, as well as creating stereotypes. These are the attitudes that we form about others based on the categorization process. It's not merely that we categorize people as one type or another, but rather we also take that a step further in the sense that we start to associate traits and characteristics and behaviors with people who fall into those categories, rightly or wrongly. Again, with varying degrees of positive or negative evaluations based on that specific type. And of course, in dating relationships and that sort of things, we'll often say quite, colloquial, oh, he's not my type, or she's just my type. Again, we may not even be conscious of the processes involved because we're already conditioned to be biased based on the various visual and other cues that we've received that allow us to categorize people. Consider what happens if you're walking alone on a street late at night. Does your instant or instinctive reaction differ based, for example, just on the gender of the person who approaches you or any other characteristics of who might be approaching you? What if it were a snake? I'm not kidding. Uh, do you know what ophidiophobia is? Well, it's the fear of snakes. And indeed, an overwhelming fear that some people have. In fact, a lot of people don't like snakes. I was reading an article in my Scientific American a couple of years ago talking about how social media could help change people's attitudes and views about snakes. Quoting from the article, researchers have long sought to understand the roots of this aversion, that is, of snakes, theorizing that primates might have evolved an innate fear in response to being preyed upon by constrictor-like snakes. Human infants do pay special attention to images of snakes and snake-like movements, though without necessarily being scared. It may be that culture turns an inborn human ability to detect snakes into a fear. End quote. In short, we learn how to be afraid of snakes. And there's research that shows that snake fears can be reduced through a combination of two key factors: habituation and knowledge. Habituation refers to the degree to which our exposure increases our familiarity with the unknown. And it's the familiarity that, at least in part, inoculates us against the fears. And from an even more purely cognitive standpoint, as we learn more about the unknown and increase our knowledge, that too tends to lessen the fear that we have. Of course, there's a flip side to the learning process as well. We may be taught specifically only the bad things about the previously unknown. And some of our patterning and categorization obviously comes from our experiences, and much of this is learned from our parents. These are our primary socialization agents to varying degrees. Again, not everyone has both parents. There can be other caregivers involved as well. But it's these critical, significant others early in our lives that have the greatest impact in terms of how we view and evaluate the world around us. And the evidence demonstrates an important learning effect of children who tend to mimic their parents, especially in their earliest years, even using the same voices, the same lines of reasoning that their parents use in rendering their judgments. And that's often their main, or maybe even in some cases, their sole point of reference. But of course, the learning can continue and does continue throughout our lives and can have a further impact later on. The patterns, of course, then are also replicated through the media, through online interactions, through the digital revolution, as well as through the old forms of media, like television and radio and the movies and so forth. Again, to either positive or negative effects. How are the characters typically portrayed? What tropes or stereotypes might be reinforced? And to what extent do we already prejudge the characters based on our background and experiences when we see them in terms of race or ethnicity or gender or other characteristics? In short, there are already broader institutional forces at play too that can help nurture our biases further, for better or worse. And that's my final point. Where or to whom do we have a positive predisposition or bias? Yes, of course, we can have, and we do have positive biases and preferences. Okay? So, in general, we're biased towards the familiar, the habitual, the context, and the people where we get along and we don't have to think too much about how to communicate with them, where we're most comfortable, if you will. And so we're biased towards our own family, our own language, our own culture, or our people in general. If I'm lost in Beijing and I can't speak Mandarin and I really need help, I'm going to be biased towards the Chinese person who can speak both Mandarin and English. And I'll be even more biased, perhaps, if I happen to run into somebody who speaks English and they're from my own country as well. And so we all have both positive and negative biases. These then directly influence how and with whom we're inclined to interact, to get to know, and ultimately whom we like and love and view as deserving of our attention and our support. And so you can well imagine then how the broader institutional forces to which we're exposed can then reinforce further those biases. Again, be they positive or negative biases, and how we'll readily, perhaps in some cases, start to align ourselves and identify with particular groups. But that's another story for another day. So until next we meet, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. Take care.